So I'm recording. So do you want to just say who you are and your
Sure,
title?
sure. My name's Paul Byrne. I have a background in marine biology. I studied marine biology and marine ecology at Sydney University, and I've worked in marine biology up on the Great Barrier Reef. So I've shared knowledge about the Great Barrier Reef to tourists, but also had a little bit of work. I guess as part of my studies with the Australian Institute of Marine Science, and a couple of my lecturers, a guy called Dr. Mike Kingsford and Dr. Ove Gilberg, which is a bit of a mouthful. Ove is actually quite well known now via the Greenpeace organisation. So, yeah, happy to talk about anything you like around marine biology.
Awesome. Okay. So we'll dive straight into this. So first question: when working as a marine biologist, what was the main killer of our marine life?
I guess that's a really hard question to answer directly because there's always lots of different factors that can impact. But you can't get away from pollution. And I guess the main thing that I saw was phosphorus from detergents that were leaching into the environment. So it's actually interesting in somewhere like the Great Barrier Reef. It's actually quite nutrient poor in the water. That's why it's so clear. And there's upwelling that sort of is involved with that, where warm water meets cold water. And that's how the nutrients come up through the continental shelf. But when you've got, I guess, farming very close to the Great Barrier Reef and leaching, so runoff basically, what happens is, I guess, to keep it in layman's terms, nutrients go into overload, and so that's where algae and so forth can form and actually start to grow out of control, out of their natural balance, because we've added more nutrients into the system, and as a consequence, that can actually make the coral suffer. So I would say it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I would say the major issue for me was added nutrients into the system, so in this case, phosphorus.
Right. Okay. What are some key aspects to helping any marine species survive?
Yeah, I guess from a human perspective, it's understanding. I think one of the things that I've tried to share is before you change something, you really need to understand what's impacting it. And to do that, you need to take measurements, you need to have evidence. So I think enabling marine species to survive is actually understanding the life cycle of that organism, its interactions with other organisms, if there's any symbiotic relationships, which is, I guess, where one species can benefit from another, but there's also the whole win-win you've probably heard of,
Yep.
and understanding what it requires for its life cycle. So in order to help, you really need to understand what its requirements are, and how it reproduces and the environment in which it finds itself, and you can only do that by measuring it.
Right. Okay. In your opinion, what is the main killer of sharks in Australia?
Look, well, in Australia, I suppose it would be nets at beaches and so forth. And there is, generally speaking, pollution in the oceans, no matter where you are, because of the currents and what have you. Although Australia probably does better compared to a lot of countries. But fear in respect of people not understanding what sharks are about. I mean, I've gone diving with hundreds of sharks, and it is one of those things that humans tend to be afraid of what they don't know. So it comes back to the other answer, I suppose, is genuinely trying to make an effort to understand. And I think it's the ignorance and the fear that is the main killer for sharks and why they are hunted.
Right. Okay. Do breeding plans really work, or are they just a way to get money from the government?
Interesting question. I think breeding plans do work once you understand the life cycle. I guess the question is, what's the purpose? So, breeding plans have happened in commercial operations. If you think about salmon farms and what have you, and tuna farms for a long, long time, there's a lot of commercial interest, and in fact, there's an awesome opportunity to really expand aquaculture, which this country's started to do quite well. Governments tend to not focus on necessarily warm and fuzzy all the time, and in the sense of trying to get back into government. I think though the governments, generally speaking, at least in this country, tend to want to do a good job, but they've only got a certain budget, so they've got to decide where they're focusing that money on. Ideally we could spend money everywhere, but that's just not realistic. So I think some breeding plans really work, and others may or may not. But it's really about saying, well, what's the 80-20 rule? So where can we invest money in breeding programs that won't require as much investment but have a greater payback? And so typically things like aquaculture, like the prawn issue we're having here, we are investing money to fix the white spot disease. However, I guess there's debate about how to get here in the first place.
Yeah. Another question. Did you ever rescue a shark or watch someone rescue a shark? And if so, what was wrong with it?
No, I haven't. But I guess I have interacted with a lot of sharks in my time, having done, loads of dives. And so I haven't had to deal with that situation specifically. Having said that, I have seen sharks with a lot of fish hooks, and I'm a recreational fisherman, so I understand that, people do go out to deliberately catch sharks, but they also go out and don't deliberately catch sharks. And I suppose the only way I've really rescued a shark in that sense is if I've seen hooks embedded in them. But I think it's about understanding what's the best way to, for example, fish with barbless hooks and being able to use circle hooks. So it's a better hooking mechanism. And if there is, if you do catch a shark or any fish for that matter, and it's the hook's in their gut, which might sound a bit strange from a marine biologist to say, but I am a realist. It's about not trying to rip it out because you'll actually kill the fish. You're better off leaving it there. So, but specifically rescuing a shark, no.
In your opinion, are the fish around Australia healthy, and are there a good number of them?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I would say different species behave differently and dealing with human interactions in a different way. So I think away from populated areas there are healthy numbers of fish out on the reef, but the cohorts and the diversity of those species might be changing. I haven't looked at that recently, so I'm really talking anecdotally. But if you think about aquaculture, yellowfin tuna, bluefin tuna are doing really well in certain aspects because we have a commercial interest in them. Orange roughy has suffered in the past and on South Tasman rise, but it's also benefited from commercial fishing, as weird as that sounds. So I think it's a very hard question to answer. Generally speaking, I'd say they're suffering. The king fishery, for example, in Sydney Harbour for years when there was a commercial fishery there, they were decimated, but it's fairly well documented, particularly from fishermen, believe it or not, that in recent years the king fishery in Sydney Harbour and its surrounds has moments where it goes gangbusters because the population has been able to rebound because there's less commercial fishing pressure.
Yeah. Okay. Is illegal fishing as big as a problem as it is advertised?
Oh, yeah, I think in elements it is, and I suspect that's partly a cultural issue. So we have a fantastic diversity of cultures over in this country, but at the risk of saying we need more legislation, I don't think every fisherman is aware. So illegal fishing I actually split into genuinely not knowing, and there's a level of ignorance there, and then there's deliberate illegal fishing. I do think deliberate legal fishing, and if I can expand fishing into, for example, catching crabs, in mud crabs and so forth, it's well documented that crab pots get nicked by other fishermen and people put too many pots out, and thankfully there are some fairly serious fines, but often it could be argued they need to be a little bit harsher. So that's definitely an issue. Is it causing the downfall of a fishery? It's very difficult to say, and I really couldn't provide answers on
that. Is the rubbish around Australia really affecting the marine life?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt. We've certainly come a long way from the whole as I was growing up, the whole six-pack, beer plastic rings that unfortunately is a classic image of our marine life suffering. You still have the whole issue around plastic bags and, the turtles eating that, for example. Absolutely. I mean, if you go up to northern Queensland or even anywhere around the north of Australia, you will see thongs and a whole range of stuff that gets floated down through the currents from the rest of the world, particularly the Asian area, I suppose, because it's close to us. And there's no doubt that has not just an aesthetic impact, it's impacting animals who, animals, generally speaking, if they're predators, that they're opportunistic, so they sort of bite first and ask questions later. And that's just the nature of evolution and what they need to do to survive. So, unfortunately, animals don't have the ability perhaps to learn as quickly as humans do, and so they're impacted by our poor decisions and by our pollution. Not just from a chemical perspective, but just, wanting to bite something and seeing what it is and then ingesting it and it kills them. So it's definitely an issue in this country as it is in others.
Yeah.
As far as oil slicks and so forth, I think we've been incredibly lucky. We've got the greatest reef system in the world.
Mm-hmm.
How we haven't had more accidents is somewhat amazing, and I think it is partly due to a good level of management of understanding the importance of that. I'm sure we drop the ball now and then on the importance of it, but generally speaking, we have our own pilots to navigate big shipping containers through the reef.
Yeah.
There's not much margin of error in certain parts of there, but that you still do get the runoff, which I mentioned earlier, and then there's when we're exporting coal and primary industries, you are going to get leachate going into the water. And I guess I'm focusing on the reef because that's where a lot of my study was.
Yeah. What is the most successful management plan you have heard of from right now?
Yeah, well, I might give two examples. So the I guess Grumpa, Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, I know recently there's been a lot of criticism about the way the reef is dying, and that's true, and it's actually quite hard to say that's our fault. Certainly we could take care of it a lot better, but, water moves around the world, so and ocean temperatures rise, and the whole global warming debate I guess we could talk about, but I think the way, generally speaking, that they manage the park, where there's recreational areas, that there's green zones, and as someone who's worked, for example, on boats taking tourists out, they try to spread the pressure of tourists. So from that sense, I think for such a large area, the intentions and what's being done from a management plan perspective have been overall I guess effective in reducing the severity of human impact. Could it be better? Absolutely. The other one I guess I'm thinking of is I mentioned earlier orange roughy. So orange roughy is a deep water fish. We tend to share a fishery between Australia and New Zealand on what's called the South Tasman Rise. It commands a very high price. We have had issues in the past where other vessels have pilfered that and have actually pilfered the breeding stock because orange roughy mature very, very late. So you're kind of talking from memory sort of in 20 to 30 years, human years obviously, before they're sexually mature. So if you take away that breeding stock, a bit like taking the female crabs in Queensland, then you're actually stopping the reproduction. And that's coming back to the original thing about understanding the life cycle of the organism. So I know work has been put in place to prevent that happening, and Australia and New Zealand have worked together to try to co-manage that, and I think they've started to be effective on it. But I guess we haven't got to the stage here yet where, for example, I know Canada in the past has actually had military intervention to shoot over the bows of fishing vessels and sink them. Where like take possession of them and burn them or sink them to prevent illegal fishing. So yeah, they're sort of the two I'd focus on.
Right. Are the population, like shark populations of Australia, improving?
Well, look, I guess I haven't really done a lot of work in that area. What I would say as someone who's gone diving a lot and has taken a lot of people diving is I think there has been an increase in particular areas, but other areas are threatened. I guess the thing that you may get out of this interview is there's no one straight answer. It depends on the conditions in the particular area. And if I can give an example, you can read a recipe on how to bake a cake, but different people bake it differently. You can study an animal in one place and it behaves a certain way, and you study it in another and it survives or behaves differently, and there's obviously factors that are involved with that. So unfortunately the nature of biology and the environment is that it's not just A causes B. They could be correlated, but may not be causation, and it's not just A and B, there's hundreds of factors. So it's actually very difficult to say. Excuse me, I haven't looked at any recent studies, but anecdotally, again, I would say that I've seen more sharks. I've caught more sharks, for example, just because I am a recreational fisherman, as a percentage of my catch, and I wouldn't be surprised if they are on the rebound because of the way that we're starting to, for example, in Sydney Harbour, it's no longer commercial fishing, so you're just naturally going to get recruitment increasing so long as the population hasn't hit a point of no return.
Yeah. So when you said you've been diving with heaps of sharks, have you ever been diving with grey nurses?
Yes, I have. So there's a key dive site which I understand. I live in Brisbane now, but I understand they've sort of protected it for this very point, a place called Magic Point off the south head of Maroubra. That's a very well-known spot, and I've also been to Seal Rocks up in around Foster. So yes, I have gone diving with them several times.
In your opinion, do you think the population is all right?
No, I think it's interesting that you asked me about rebounding. I know that the times that I was at Magic Point, the numbers continued to decline, and I suspect that's part of the reason why fisheries and the powers that be sort of started to say that it was a protected zone. And I know I've only been to Foster a couple of times, and there were good, healthy populations when I was there, but I'm talking 15 years ago. I know that there is some concerns around there now, but it is a species that is easily caught because of the nature of the food that it eats, and it's the sorts of size of fishes that it consumes comes back to fisheries and human interaction, and they tend to live fairly close to our coastline. So they're not an oceanic, or pelagic is the term we'd use, pelagic shark species. They tend to hang around bays and inlets and creek systems and estuaries and coastal areas. So I guess what I'd say is they're naturally going to have some form of an interaction closer with humans than, say, in the middle of the ocean, generally speaking.
Are they scary to? Because they're put out as these scary sharks, but are they just placid or?
Look, it's funny. I would say that, and this is just my opinion, but I would say I liken sharks to dogs, really. They're a species that are aggressive. They're just naturally, either they're bred that way or it's part of their temperament, which is part of their biology as well. But looks can be deceiving. So I would never say a shark is placid, with the exception of, say, Port Jackson's. I mean, wobbegongs can be aggressive. I've had a wobbegong come and want to take a bite out of my fin in the past. But I've also been very, very calm around grey nose sharks and sandbar sharks and lemon sharks, and they've just swum right over the top of me. But I've also had mako sharks swim by me, and I've had tiger sharks swim by me, and bull sharks, seriously large bull sharks, very big bull sharks, which have the highest testosterone level of any animal per gram of body weight from memory in the world. So they're, naturally aggressive creatures, and because I could understand their behaviour and the way they were moving, and I didn't, encroach rather on their personal space, for lack of a better word, and kept my hands in, there wasn't an issue. But it's also understanding, again, coming back to the natural biology of an organism. If I had mullet with blood coming out of it, hanging off me, and I get bitten, I'm asking for trouble. And it's just that education piece. A shark is a predator. It's opportunistic. It has to be. Generally speaking, it depends on the species, but that's generally the case. And in fact, if you look at most predators in the world, whether it be, a crocodile, a lion, us, their eyes tend to face a little bit further forward, and they have less meals, and they don't graze. So I am being very generic here, but they have to be opportunistic, and so if they're going to attack a fish, they need to be able to hang on to it, and that's what the sandbar shark or the grey nurses or lemon sharks, and whatever you want to use the generic term, they have to be able to do, because they're not going to get that many opportunities, and if they don't, they're dead. And I guess that comes back to evolution.
Yeah. In your opinion, do you think breeding programs are expensive?
Expensive, did you say? Costly, did you say? They can be. Look, it depends where you want to invest. The return on investment, unfortunately, a lot of things in our world come back to dollars and cents, which is a human thing. It's not. Other animals don't trade in dollars and cents. It's only humans. It's absolutely. Down in Tasmania, there's a lot of research into. There was, at least when I was going through my qualifications in Jesus Edwardsi, which is Australian rock lobster, and they actually walk around the South Island of New Zealand. Dr. Mike Kingsford was a leader in that, and that makes sense to understand that, because people eat lobsters and they're bloody delicious, and it's understanding how do we maintain that marine resource without pilfering it till it's past its critical mass. I mentioned the tuna pens. There's a lot of money put towards those. There's research on land in big pens to understand about the age, weight, size, all of the aspects of the organism, or in this case the tuna's life cycle, and trying to understand what's the return on investment and when should we harvest them, because basically, to be blunt, that's why people invest in many times. It's so that there's a return on investment. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, yeah? So if tourism is a very similar view, if we can invest in a resource that people are willing to see and interact rather than perhaps killing it, but in this case it is a farming operation, there are multiple ways that we can invest. So is it expensive? Absolutely, it can be expensive. Does it have to be? I guess it depends on the strategy that you want to implement and what's a smart way to go about it. So I think one of the cheapest ways is actually by government putting strategies together and educating children through school, so there's less fear. There's an appreciation of the wonder, and that's a part of it, and that they should be proud to have it and defend it.
So that's all the questions I have.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for doing all this.
No problem. And look, I guess in summary, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer. What's important is trying to understand why things are the way they are, and then we can help predict where things need to be. And in science, there's a lot of you'll hear a lot of people say scientifically proven. Science doesn't prove anything. Okay, science disproves things. It does its best to get its peers to say, "I've got this idea. Prove me wrong." Because this is the evidence I have. Prove me wrong, and that's okay. I don't mind being proven wrong. I want to get to the truth, and so that's kind of what I've enjoyed about it. And so a lot of the questions you've asked, in my opinion, but really what makes it powerful is going out and measuring it. And then you can make an informed, what someone like me would say, an evidence-based decision-making. And that's something that, if we can get that point through education, we have the ability to change the world.
Yeah. Cool. So I'll finish up the recording. Thank
Sure.
you so much.
No problem, Zach.